is work.
Yep,
There we go.
I just did it on the cloud there, so.
Okay.
John, I don't believe we've met, or maybe we have.
Well, I'm a friend of Rick or Fred Carpenter. He goes by these two names, Rick Carpenter and Fred Carpenter. And I call him Rick Carpenter. I don't know what Art calls him because you know him very well, don't you, Art?
Oh, yes, I went to RMC with him. And
Okay, so that's some few years that you've known him. But do you call him Rick or do you call him Fred?
I call him Fred.
Okay, well, but Fred, he came over here to Europe and worked for some time for NATO, and he called himself Rick. So I call him Rick. But anyhow, he and I, we became friends when he was working over here for NATO in Europe. I was not working for NATO. I was working for the European Union. But anyhow, we met because our wives were both studying French together. And so I and Rick, or Fred, became good friends. And we talked a lot about global affairs and environmental affairs. And with his help, I wrote a book on the subject. And then a couple of years, he stayed in Brussels for a couple of years, and then he went back to Canada, I think back to Ottawa. And then, but we stayed in touch. And a couple of years ago, he suggested that I join the Canadian branch of the Club of Rome, and that's what I did. And that's how. And I'm still a member, even though I'm still over here in Brussels. And that's how I know Art, and I know Raymond, and I know various others. But I don't think I yet know Ruben.
No reason you should. What is it you're doing in Brussels? What is it you're doing in Brussels?
Well, right at the moment, I'm writing. Well, I used to work for the European Union. I worked on the expansion of the European Union to Eastern Europe. I was part of the team which expanded the European Union from 15 member states to 25 member states. And after that happened, I worked on agriculture, on the common agricultural policy, which is a hugely controversial subject. And then after that, I left because I wanted to write a book on food. So I wrote a book on food, and that was published a couple of years ago. And now I'm stuck my head, for better or worse, into this whole climate business, and I've been reading and reading and reading about that, and that's what I do.
Well, it would be interesting in some other occasion to have a conversation. Bill Reese, a name I expect you know if you've been reading in climate.
Yeah.
Bill and I were invited by an American group to do a session at the AAAS conference in Seattle in 2020, just before COVID hit, under the heading of "Will modern civilization be the death of us?" And we both argued that most likely yes.
Most likely, yes. Yes. Well, most likely, yes. I think that's a fairly accurate prediction. Most likely, but not completely likely.
Well, no, in a world that's a living complex system, as you well know, as Stuart Kaufman is fond of saying, with complex living systems, you cannot pre-state their future.
Exactly. Exactly. I would agree with that. I know that. I mean, maybe you want to. I'll stop talking now because I've talked enough, and I'll hand back to Art.
Well,
I was just going to say hello to everyone, and I noticed that Raymond, your mic is still muted, and you probably don't need to have it.
It's just to try to cut down on the noise that I've muted it. So
Yeah, good enough.
Okay, now we are recording this, and really, David and Ruben, who are going to be leading the conversation and trying to develop some ideas on what can be done with the conference of the parties to make it viable, or maybe junk the whole thing and come out with some other suggestions. But by and large, I don't think you'll find too many people who will think that the COP is functioning just fine. And the mere fact that it's under the tight grip of the fossil fuel industry is all right. I don't think anybody will agree with that. And so
Not Art, not on this particular Zoom chat anyway.
so let me turn it over to you, David, and let you make some introductory remarks and some of your initial thoughts, and then Ruben, you can have a go. Why don't we give you about 10 minutes, David, and Ruben give you the same, and then we can start discussing what's going on.
Well, Art, I don't know that I need 10 minutes. I didn't know how many people would show up. There was some traffic back and forth with people who had signed a letter that was sent, I guess, by the Club of Rome initiated it, making suggestions about COP. And I thought, Ruben, your comments were, if not acerbic, at least not entirely encouraging for those sending this kind of a letter. You made reference to people who had studied Politics 101, and they would know that this was not going to be a very useful device. And I signaled back to Ruben and I said, well, for those who missed taking Politics 101, what suggestions would you make to get a better COP? Because I actually thought there was some good points in the letter, although I hadn't been part of it in the development of it. And so Ruben said, well, David, that's a really good question. Why don't we see whether there's some input from folks at CACOR? So I'll turn it over to Ruben very shortly, but my take is that sometimes we spend too much time when it comes to trying to understand how social change operates to try to pinpoint the activity which is going to be the most useful. And I've always seen social change as a kind of continuum when it comes to advocacy. So years ago, I worked with Project Plowshares as their education person. And I remember in those days, we did do some fundraising and we did buy up an advertisement, a half page in the Globe and Mail when it was in the days when it was still not too pricey. And we took some time to get some fairly well-known Canadians to put their names to this particular ad. And it may have had more effect in those days, but I never saw it as something that would change the world or change government policy. I just saw it as one more arrow in a quiver of tools to do general education, to do different kinds of advocacy. And I'll reference when I joined the Pembina Institute, and no, even before, in the early days when we launched a campaign to end Canadian bank loans to the government of South Africa. And a group of us were written up in the Edmonton Journal as part of the lunatic fringe. And I noted, I never felt badly about having that designation, I must say. But I noted that a few years later, the things that we were saying were the very same things that were now coming out from the senior officials at External Affairs. That things change, things sometimes take time. And so I've always seen social change as a continuum between the lunatic fringe, which sometimes I find myself on, and opportunities to have those quiet dinners with a senior official that might make some very significant difference. I remember when Mark McGuigan was Minister of External Affairs, and I had a certain relationship with him. And I know that on a monthly basis, he had dinner with about 5 individuals. And those 5 individuals were probably worth about 15,000 letters that I've been involved in getting groups across Canada to write to lobby to end military assistance to El Salvador from the United States. And McGuigan basically let me know that, yeah, that was the case, that he turned to these individuals. And that led me to think, okay, if we could begin to identify some of these individuals that were worth 15,000 letters, those were some of the people I wanted to have dinner with. And so I just see that to get different kinds of social change into the mix, I thought the letter actually made some good points, but I did agree with Ruben that these things on their own don't have much power. But I think that it's a part of the arrows of the quiver. So that would be, I think, my opening reflection. And I guess the other question we have to ask, I used to have great verbal battles with my colleague Ernie Regier when he was the chief researcher and founder of Project Plowshares. And I was hired as the education coordinator. And he was quite comfortable speaking truth to power. And he didn't really care at one level if he was successful in changing government policy or changing their mind. He just thought it was an awfully important thing in any healthy society to have people that would identify, as he understood it, truth, and to continue to push, on that, through that lens, and to make statements in that vein. And others of us would sometimes say, yeah, but if you want to move the yardsticks, we better nuance this a little more fully. We better not try to go for the whole ball of wax. We ought to go for that piece that we can actually, bring into existence. So for example, when I was at Pembina, I was probably more along that trajectory. And I remember teaming up with Rick George from Suncor as part of a coalition trying to get tax credits for wind power development in Canada. And we met with 3 cabinet ministers in one day through Rick George's graces, not through mine. And they looked at the masthead, they looked at who was opposed to this, and they thought it was something doable. And so in the next budget, they brought down these tax credits for those investing in wind energy. So I saw that as a win. Not that it changed the world, but it moved the yardsticks. So I think when we're talking about social change, we have to decide, are we on the trajectory of truth to power, or are we trying to move the yardsticks in a practical way? So with that reflection, I think I'll pass it back over to Ruben to comment.
Lovely distinctions. Broadly, I agree with everything you've said, including the fact that my note was acerbic.
Okay, goodbye now.
I'll come back to that. That one of the things you don't know, David, is that I used to hold the share in the Royal Bank of Canada for the Anglican Church of Canada.
Ah.
And that it was my job to engage with senior executives in the Royal Bank about the question of what are you doing with our money in South Africa?
Ah, very good.
It was in the 70s. And I would go to Royal Bank meetings in which I would be the only 30-year-old in the room and the only one not in a banker's blue suit at a time when the only women were serving coffee or taking notes. None of them were seen as shareholders. And it was my job then to go to the mic and raise questions that, of course, I mean, the Royal at that point had a VP for social affairs who actually had trained under Wilfred Cantwell Smith at McGill and had a master's degree in the history of religion. So the conversations were back to the fact that social change in a complex world, it's a nonlinear system. And therefore, you don't know. Big efforts don't necessarily give you big results. And you certainly don't know from small efforts where you've planted seeds. And I agree, a whole range of things is needed. I want to show a slide that just, and thank you, Art, for letting me do this, that we've all seen. Simply because it's used a lot in articles. It's one of Bill Reese's favorites. And all it does is capture the fact that our conversations in the world about climate change have had no noticeable impact on climate change as a phenomenon. And so that in that sense, it really raises the question of what are we doing and are we serious? I'm going to come back to that language of being serious. But I just want to note also a little bit of history that when the Intergovernmental Council on Climate Change was being established, this is back in the late 1980s, after the conference in Toronto on the atmosphere, which is the first global conference on the atmosphere, summer of '88. In August, happened to hit a hot spell in Toronto. I've often wondered if their decisions would have been different had they met in February. Because of the hot spell, they got all excited about warming. And so it was really coming out of that they decided they needed some kind of intergovernmental panel. And you may remember that at that point, folks at Boulder were particularly influential in this work. And I had been in touch with them just given the work that I'd been doing. And so they wrote me a note saying, "What's your advice?" And I wrote them a note saying, "My advice is that you recognize that the way we now think about and talk about science is a trap. And that people who believe that if we just had more science and believe the truth of science would be well, that's not going to work. Because science at the time absolutely, and even today, does not understand us as human persons and as communities. We've even changed the social sciences from the social sciences to the behavioral sciences. So we study human beings in the same way we study coyotes and falcons. From the outside, as if the inner life doesn't make any difference, which is, of course, what the quiet dinners with 5 people, that was all about. How are those conversations changing the way I see and experience the world, which is an inner process. And so what I'm saying is that I didn't ever hear from them again. They just wrote me off as somebody who's trivial. You may remember that body got set up without any social science or humanities people involved at all. Zero. It took them 15 years to even recognize they need the behavioral sciences, and they still don't recognize that anything beyond that. So that my sense is, my point is that the graph that I was showing makes sense to me because it's what I would expect in a culture that doesn't understand itself and that does science that's not reflexive, because reflexivity is required to understand yourself and then to understand other selves as people who might come to understand themselves. And it's in that sense that when I saw the letter from the Club of Rome, it struck me just entirely as virtue signaling. It might have been an acceptable. It doesn't mean that there was nothing in the letter in terms of important points, but it means that the people who signed that letter, if you look at the status and the experience of the people who signed the letter, not the Club of Rome, all they did was trigger it. Relatively few of the people who signed it are Club of Rome members. But if you look at that total list, these are some really important people. They have access in all kinds of ways. And to write a letter like this for these people is not serious. It means that they don't have a serious understanding of the cultural mess we're in and how to engage with that. I mean, it's back in part to David's point. Yes, culture change is somewhat mysterious, but it's not nearly as mysterious as, in a sense, and this may sound rude, and I don't mean it entirely that way, but I've spent my life in this space, and I've come to understand how little interest we as a modern culture actually have in understanding modern culture and how it works. That what we're interested in is the efficient increase in the economy and other things then beside that. And so my response to that letter was that it wasn't serious, that these people themselves had the Club of Rome called together a conclave to say to people, given the access we've had, the experience we've had, what are the ways that we might intervene in this system? To be as thoughtful as David has been and to say, well, there are different ways. There are letters, and to say, well, we have enough influence that we could get 1,000 other bodies to write the kind of letter that, but it would be a waste for us to write that letter because we actually have access to people in a way that we could make a difference. And the fact that they weren't serious just says to me it's consistent with the response of the folks in Boulder. We had been in a conversation for some years, and when my advice, and I knew that my advice would run counter to where they were headed, and that I would be seen as an outlier, but they didn't even so much as send me a letter that said, thank you, Ruben, but we won't be in further touch with you. They just dropped me like a hot potato. My sense is we are in serious trouble, and that climate change is just a symptom of it. And the fact that we chase climate change in the way we do shows that no one, and I mean no one, there is no institution in the world that is a significant institution that has an understanding that we need of how modern cultures work and the nature of the trouble that we're in. And therefore, we behave as unconscious modern cultures behave. It's kind of like seeing the behavior of your sister's kids when they're 14. They behave like unconscious 14-year-olds. God bless them. And in one sense, it's wonderful as long as they haven't destroyed anything that's really important or themselves. But what I'm saying is we don't even understand the nature of the trouble we're in. And the Club of Rome demonstrated that they don't understand it nearly as much as they think they do. And so for me, that letter was a signal, a further signal, of which there are, I see many, that as a culture, we don't yet understand the nature of the trouble we're in, or even how to organize, to think about it, and to explore it, much less cope with it. And in that sense, I want to say to those people, yeah, you're not serious. This was something you blew off and felt good about yourself. I understand that. I'm a human being too. I know how to behave. I've worked for a prime minister, for Justin's father, so I know what it's like to be somewhat close to serious political power. But I think we're in a position that we need people who are serious and knowledgeable. And at the moment, we have relatively few of those in senior places. Says he as if he knows what he's talking about.
What would you write and to whom?
Well, I wouldn't have that group write. I would have had that.
What would you write and to whom? I don't care who they are. Who would you have write to whom? And who would actually be prepared to read it?
Ask me for advice. I would use the contacts you've got, create a conclave of people, and identify the various actions that could be taken. Most of them would be under the radar and private, would never be known about. They're like the 5 dinners that David talked about that might make a difference. There would also be some public things, but they wouldn't be with the Club of Rome's names attached. There are all kinds of other groups who can write that kind of letter. And so, I mean, the mere fact that they didn't even, there's no evidence that they stopped to think long enough to even ask the question, what would we do here, given the opportunities and the access that we have collectively, what would we do if we were serious? That there's no evidence that question was asked. And from my point of view, senior people, especially senior men, and I say this as a white male who's had access to elites for much of my life, who are not reflexive enough to understand that their routine responses are not serious, and that the modern world is quite happy to have them respond routinely because the modern world knows how to deal with them. And what we need to be doing is developing responses that actually put some sticks in the spokes of the modern world's wheels. And we're not doing that.
Okay, just to put a little order in this, John McClintock, why don't you go ahead, and followed by Raymond Lurie.
Okay, well, I'm over here in the European Union, and that's quite a different organization from Canada politically. So I see things a little bit differently. But if I could go back to David Pollock's point about social change. Now, definitely we need social change. We need to change people's attitudes towards fossil fuels, about energy use and so forth. But surely the main objective that every country of the world has to strive for at the moment is much better international cooperation, because this is it not the purpose of the Conference of the Parties is to achieve a high level of international cooperation between all the countries of the world, Canada, China, United States, Britain. And so we need to get an agreed plan of action for every country needs to know what it's got to do in order to bring down its emissions. So we need a plan of action, and not only a plan of action, we could say we've already had 3 plans of action, the latest of which is the Paris Agreement of 2015. But we need countries to respect these plans of actions, but they don't. And the reason they don't respect the plans of action is because they can free ride. And we see every country, including the European Union, free riding. They don't take these climate agreements seriously. And that surely is the problem which we need to address. So I'd put that forward to you, gentlemen, who see things from the Canadian point of view. Is not free riding one of the big problems with this COP process? Okay, so I'll stop there. I've got a lot more to say, but I'm sure you have your own perspectives, and I want to listen to the Canadian perspective before putting forward the European Union perspective on this, how to get a high level of international cooperation.
Okay, Raymond Lurie, you're up, and David Pollock, you're on deck.
Very interesting discussion up to now. And Ruben, if you think about how and why is the fossil fuel industry winning at this point, right? So what have they done to get us to this place where people don't seem to care about the environment as much as they should, et cetera, right? My thinking is we have to use similar tactics, which comes back to what you were saying, is having conversations with people who are influential and people who are decision makers to try to push the yardsticks one step at a time, right? So what I've been talking to other members of CACOR about is having an approach where we sort of agree on you know, some of the things we want to be pushing, and we formulate an actual intentional plan of well, you, Ruben, you know these 10 people, so you're going to go and talk to this 10 people about this, and then maybe we'll write a letter, maybe we'll do an op-ed, maybe, but we're having a full program intentionally trying to move a specific issue. You see, that's what the oil industry is doing, right? They have PR firms, the best in the world, and they have you know, scientists who know how to manipulate public opinion, that are working on messaging and everything that they need to do to get people to change their opinion, right? So I think the only way we could fight back is to use the same techniques, really, and try to counter their message. Now, we're pretty small compared to them, but we are what we are, right?
Okay.
I have other comments too, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, David, do you want to go ahead?
Yes. when I signaled Art that I wanted to respond to Ruben, that's true, but I did it just before I saw who else was on, and I realized that Ray Murphy is on, and he can very well speak for himself when he gave that excellent presentation sort of a week or 10 days ago, I guess. But what I wanted to come zero in on, Ruben, is a couple of times in your opening comments, you were presenting, as I understood it, the notion that nobody, no institution has an understanding of what needs to be done, if you like, or understands the culture well enough, is not reflexive enough. I remember conversations I've had with Bill Reese, whom I've traveled with on occasion, and you know very well. And he used to say, is there not just one leader, political leader, that has the understanding and the willingness and the ability to stand up and talk about the need to change our economic focus away from more, and more. And so it seems to me that at one level of understanding, it's not the whole story, of course, about how we get inside people's heads, but one level of understanding is that an awful lot of life as we've come to enjoy it has depended on one form of energy or another. And in our age, it's been fossil fuels, which is ruinous for our world. And that as long as populations grow and as long as economies are based on the need to always grow, that you need an understanding and a leadership that will begin to really focus on the deeper meanings of sustainability and even the degrowth sides of some economies that may go hand in hand with growth for the poorest of the poor. But as Ray was talking in his presentation, if we look at the number of private jets and the number of middling affluent people, their air flights, it seems to me that it's those behaviors that need tremendous leadership. And I think we do have an understanding that more is just not viable. So that would be my comment at this stage.
If I may ask, who is the we who have the understanding that more is not viable? What percentage of the Canadian population, or
Oh, I think it's tiny, right? I think it's tiny, but I do think that most of us are in line to get honorary PhDs in rationalization. You know, it's really easy to argue the exceptions and why you should be excused from the notion, that more, like I think a lot more people know in their heart that more is not possible when you look at the destruction of biodiversity that's going on. I mean, anybody that does any reading of the New York Times or the Globe and Mail and so on, they know at some level that more is not viable. A few folks in CACOR know and around the world. And I suspect that there's actually quite a lot of understanding, but this ability for humans to rationalize and preserve privilege and access makes it very difficult, I think, for leadership to speak up. And Canada's in a very difficult place because we've been so blessed by our natural resources that now it becomes very expensive for us to exploit those resources and very expensive for the world. So I think maybe far more people know at some level that more is not viable than have spoken out. But I'd like to hear actually from Ray, who gave his presentation on consumption the other day.
Okay, could I just say a couple of words now?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, first of all, I'll have to excuse myself because I'm battling a terrible cold right now, so I'll have to leave early. But it seems to me CACOR, even that document, the open letter by CACOR, if that's what we're talking about here, it made some really important points. And one is that the whole process should be streamlined. And secondly, it should be focused much more on implementation rather than just new targets and things like that. And just a streamlined process. I mentioned in my presentation that the Glasgow CACOR did a study, and it found out that it discovered that the average amount of greenhouse gas emissions by participants at the Glasgow conference were about 2 tons of emissions per participant, and there are about 50,000 participants at CACOR. So we're talking about 100 tons of emissions by people attending CACOR. It's almost all because of planes. So I think we should obey the maxim of doctors: do no harm. So I think it's crucial to have a streamlined process rather than 50,000 people flying around the world for these CACOR meetings. And I think it'd probably be much more effective because most studies have shown that it's smaller groups that can negotiate most effectively. If you have 1,000 people, and I really value CACOR, I think it's really important. It's done a lot of good work, but I think the way it's developing right now, it's a bloated structure, and it's, as you people have mentioned, it's being taken over by the
You
fossil
mean
fuel
COP,
industry.
right, Raymond? Not
I'm sorry?
CACOR. You mean COP, not CACOR,
Oh,
right?
COP. Sorry. Yeah, sorry about that. No,
I
COP.
don't
I
feel
meant
too
COP.
bloated.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that the COP structure has been bloated. It also has to be much more oriented toward the implementation. And because that's the big failing now. We've had all sorts of conferences, but the implementation is lagging far behind. So look, that's basically the point I just wanted to make, or the 2 points I wanted to make. But I'm sorry, I'm going to have to leave probably right now or very, very soon because I'm not feeling that well. So I wish you all the best for the conference, for the discussion.
Okay, and I guess the other matter with the 10,000, 20,000 people, I mean, this sounds like a social event where people are going to go and interact with each other, because that's just way too many people to make anything meaningful happen. And not only that, over half of those participants were lobbyists. Yeah, and or maybe there was more lobbyists than there were, in fact, those there to try and contain the fossil fuel industry. Anyway, over to John McClintock. Tell us to the EU perspective, and then Raymond, you're next.
Well, gentlemen, this is all very interesting and very important. Let's go back to this point that what we really need is a very, very high level of international cooperation. Now, your perspective from Canada, when you look at Europe, and you look at it over, say, the last 60 years, now you were, certainly your fathers were involved in the Second World War, which started in Europe. It was Europeans who did not cooperate amongst themselves, which caused the Second World War. And indeed, you can say the same thing about the First World War. But now, these European countries are cooperating pretty well. Now, what do you think that the European Union is an organization which has brought countries together and achieved a high level of international cooperation? Is that what you as Canadians would conclude when you look at Europe over the last 60 or 70 years? What I would like to listen to you on that particular question.
Well, I would say yes. I have never been at a meeting of the EU or the EC where the meeting did not begin with a reminder that the EU was a peace project, and that is the driving purpose. It's not economic development. It pushed beyond that to the deeper purpose, and that is, it struck me the first time I was there, which would be 20 or 30 years ago, that has been a consistent message. There is no such consciousness in Canada about Canadian Confederation. We now have a state where each place is beginning to pull and look after itself. It's what you expect. It's what I expect in a modern world. So your free rider problem is in fact an inherent feature of modernity. As long as you've got modern cultures, you've got free riders, and there is, quote, no solution. There are ways you can minimize it to some extent, deal with some of the worst actors, but it is built, it is a feature, not a bug. And the thing that people don't understand, when I said that, of course, there are individual people in all kinds of institutions around the world who understand what I'm talking about, but there is no institution as such. There are people in universities, but as yet, no university has said, we have come to the insight that it is modernity itself that is the deepest source of our troubles. And we are a modern university, and we are now committed to outgrowing our own formation as a modern university. And we are willing to help any other university who sees this as work. That commitment is still ahead of us in time. I may not live long enough to see it happen, but as modernity disintegrates, as it will in the it's already doing so, as that increases, the odds are high that some major institution in the next 25 years will make that declaration. It will surprise the hell out of most people because we're still in a mindset that says modernity works. We have lots of problems. As long as we go at them efficiently and together, we'll be fine. And I don't believe my life's work has led me to the view that sadly that is no longer believable.
Okay, I just want to comment that when I lived in Europe in the 60s, the the movement was going on, formulating the EU, and it was really touted then as the end of 200 years of war in Europe. Over to Raymond Lurie, followed by Ted Manning.
Yeah, I could offer lots of comments. Actually, I'm very surprised of how well the EU has been able to perform from an environmental regulation point of view and all that. Now, Brexit really worries me because I'm concerned that there might be some falling apart of the EU for various reasons. But if you look at what's happening in and I won't drone on about it in Europe, there's a lot of things happening there that's not happening here in North America. That's very, very forward looking. Now, when it comes to COP, you know, I think we've made some progress. I think that the graph you showed earlier, Ruben, would be worse if we hadn't done what's been done already. Yes, the situation is bad. There's no doubt about that. But I think it would have been worse if there wouldn't have been any action. So my thought is, well, COP hasn't really done very much, but there has been other actions, and the EU is part of it with the environmental regulations there that have had some success. So instead of focusing on the COP and trying to fix COP, why not figure out where things are working and try to help those things go faster? So, for example, there was before COP, there was something in New York which I hadn't been aware of, some environmental week or something of the sort that seemed to be making some progress, right? So maybe that's where the effort should be, and COP, because it's been captured by the oil industry, is maybe no longer a mechanism that could bring us any further.
Okay, Ted Manning, followed by John McClintock.
Yeah, I'm actually going to follow Raymond because I think he's on the right track. There are success stories out there. They are just somewhat dispersed and they're not able to communicate very well with each other. Mainly, they are most successful at a very local level. And that's why I keep looking at small island developing states or small tourism-based communities that have to integrate everything together to stay in existence, where they actually have to take a broad view to save themselves. And they are in some ways at the lead of the degradation which is possible because they are so able to be sensitive to it. It's very much the same if you live on a lake, you know when the lake is degrading and you know who's peeing in it. And that essentially is the scale at which I think most humans are able to react to it. And if we can get them to share what does work with others, that's true. I'm equally distressed about the inability of most of our institutions to react or even respond to these. And you're seen as a dissident if you go out and start yelling at your local government because they're doing something really stupid. But the fact is they are really stupid and they don't know it. And it's pretty hard to reprogram somebody who's in their dotage, having been an idiot for their whole jurisdiction for their whole time. So what we are doing, just to let you know, there are some things happening. I'm reasonably positive about some of the work being done with regard to the Sustainable Development Goals. Some of that is related to the fact that I was involved in creating some of them in the idea of consumption and production, and where there's a lot of places have gone off and tried to create real activities in their own countries. Not so much ours. We really hardly had anybody there. I was there on behalf of the World Tourism Organization, not on behalf of Canada. The problem really is that the people cannot comprehend how to do big things, particularly when they have to bring half the world together to agree to do it. And I'll come right back to my city. We can't even agree to put a road through or not, because there are at least 50 different actors trying to intervene, and each of them has a different mission and a different idea. So governance is definitely not easy. That said, we can document some really astounding success stories at a relatively local level. And there are some of them working hard to stop the people peeing on them from above, because they, up to this point, can pretty well manage what's there. The small island states being some. They can't stop the sea level from rising, but they can definitely manage what they've got left. And I'll give you one final success story. It's called El Hierro. It's in Spain. It's one of the Canary Islands, and it is 100% free of petrochemicals. And why could they do that? Because they happen to have a lot of real alternatives. They have a lake on top of their mountain. So anytime it's blowing too hard, they pump water up into the lake. And anytime they need more, they let it down. You can only way to get onto it is on a ferry, and there are no non-electric vehicles allowed across on that ferry. As well, you can't even take a gallon of gas. You may be able to take a bit of lighter fluid, but they have essentially made it completely separate. Now, that is a success story. It is possible. It is now rentable, so we say. It is successful. But it did need a lot of ideas in the first. You needed a leader, it needed a pot of money, and they needed the government to step in and help them sell all their gas-powered stuff and help them replace it with electric stuff. And does it work independently? So far. But it is not, of course, independent of the whole world, of temperatures, of everything else that may happen. But it is one example of what is indeed feasible and possible, and actually does involve real people.
Okay, good. And John McClintock, followed by David Pollock.
Well, our perspective when I say our, I mean myself and a scientist whom I've been working with, is that we need a completely new approach to international cooperation. This COP system is a circus. It is ridiculous. It is not getting us anywhere. As somebody said here, you just calculate the emissions due to the aeroplanes coming in. It's a disgrace. It's shameful. And this has been going on for 30 years. It's not getting us anywhere. So what we need is a completely new approach. Now, what could that approach be? It could be the approach which has been used to get 27 independent and fractious countries into a system of common law, and that's the EU. And that system was set up by a Frenchman called Jean Monnet. And his dictum, which is the fundamental principle of the EU, is something which is not in the United Nations at all. It is the sharing of sovereignty. And it is this which has only been done in the EU, and the success of the EU, and as Ruben says, it is a peace project, and it has succeeded. Now, it's not successful in everything it does, but it has succeeded in its primary mission, which is peace between these 27 countries. And that has been achieved because of sovereignty sharing. So what we are proposing is that we adopt a system of sharing sovereignty at the global level. That's what we're going to be proposing to the Belgium chapter of the Club of Rome in a couple of weeks. We've written about it a lot. We've produced a few short summaries of our proposal. And this, we believe, because it's worked in Europe, well, why can't it work in the rest of the world?
All right, and let's go on, David, go ahead, followed by Ruben.
The problem with getting in a list is someone says something quite interesting just before you're to speak, and you don't have a chance to really mull it through. But I was actually going to go back, John, to answer your question about my take on Europe. I was listening to an interview, I just guess last night, with David Fromm, a thoughtful Republican of the old stripe letter, who's appalled at what he thinks Trump is doing to American society. But he argues that whenever you're doing an evaluation of anything in an audit, you never get it right unless you look at both the pluses and the minuses. And so it seems to me that indeed peace has, for those 27 countries, depending on how you define peace, has been largely achieved by the EU. But when I look at the forces of migration and refugees coming from other parts of the world into Europe, both from climate and for other reasons, and I look at the fragility of both the major partners in the EU, of both France and Germany, I'm worried for the future levels of cooperation on some of these climate change things that you've cited, because of those pressures. And I don't know how that will shake out in the next number of years. So it was really just that, trying to give you my response to what I thought about the European experiment. I think it's had such a trauma out of which it grew from the Second World War, that people were willing to have goals, and I think to give up sovereignty to a certain extent in order to protect that idea of peace. So the big step at an international level is whether people feel that there's a dire enough requirement for them. And, we haven't reached it, looking at that chart that Ruben opened with in terms of climate change, but the day is probably coming as we look at more droughts and more crop failures and more starvation. But it'll be very difficult in the countries that are economically the best well off, who think they can largely go it alone. So whether or not there's going to be that instinct for moving toward giving up a certain degree of greater sovereignty. I mean, when you make climate change agreements like Kyoto, whether they're honored or not, in a sense, every international agreement is a giving up of a certain degree of sovereignty. So now you disagree with that. And so I'd like to maybe hear back when it's your turn again, because my view is that when you sign on to an international agreement, you're taking on a certain responsibility. And if you're honoring that responsibility, and treaty or otherwise, then you're limiting your freedom of action, and therefore there is some giving up. Now, you may define it in a different way, and fair enough.
All right, and Ruben, followed by Claude and John again.
Um, John McClintock, do you want to get into this for a minute and I'll follow you just for the sake of coherence?
Well, yes, just to come to David's point, what I found interesting, I came across some research done by Oxford University. It was published just a couple of months ago. And they asked people in Canada, in the United States, in China, in India, in 21 countries of the world, are you in favor or are you against a democratic world government which can deal with climate change? That was the question they asked of a sample from 21 different countries, including Canada, including the United States. Are you in favor or are you against a democratic world government that can address climate change and other global problems? And I was astonished by the result, because I had thought most people would be against such an idea. But can you imagine the result? It was not 7 out of 100 who were in favor. It was 7 out of 10 who were in favor, including a majority of people in Canada, and a majority of people in China, and a majority of people in India. So I think one of the big changes which has taken place in the last 10 years is that people all over the world have become very much aware of these extreme weather events like droughts and floods and fires. And people are now realizing that the current, that we need some sort of system of global governance that can deal with it. And so 7 out of 10 people in the world want a world government which is democratic and can deal with climate change. And this, to me, is very, very encouraging.
All right, Ruben, do you want to go ahead, followed by Claude and Raymond again?
I've got two or three things. Quick thing to Ted, the little island you told us about that's now fossil fuel free. Does that mean that they have found a way to wrap their electric wires in something other than plastic? You're
Mute
muted.
yourself. You're muted.
Here, I get it off. Yeah, they use dead tourist corpses. It tends to insulate. No, the answer is that they do not burn fossil fuels. It does not mean that they do not use any minerals or substances to live with. They are allowed to use plastic cans, or actually probably not now, just metal cans to carry the water up the hill if they wish. They don't have to cup their hands and take there are limits. Now, have they diminished their consumption or certainly burning of fossil fuels? And the answer is yes. Even the ferry boat from the island that takes them across is 100% electric, and is charged at their island from their own solar and wind, and they're very lucky. They are very they have about 300 days of bright sun every year. They also have very strong winds. Whenever it's not sun, they have both. So the answer is yes, they are very fortunate, but they have also gone whole hog to create themselves as essentially a sanctuary from fossil fuels, certainly from the burning of fossil fuels, not from incoming.
No,
Okay, Ruben.
that's a helpful distinction, that they're no longer burning them and using them directly. The secondary use is ubiquitous, and if they tried to get rid of that, it would collapse their culture.
That is indeed correct. Also, it may not be necessary. There are other the other elements that need to be addressed, as we found when we did the SDGs. There's an awful lot of different ones.
I don't want to argue that now. I'm just
Yeah.
trying to get clear about what the limits
Yeah.
are up to.
Okay, Claude. Oh,
no.
you finished, Ruben?
No, I'm not.
Okay.
Sovereignty sharing, and in part, the note that I believe Raymond put in the chat strikes me as that I'm not sure that without the First and Second World Wars, as well as not just the Second World War, but the way that it came about with the Nazification of Germany and much of Europe, I expect that without that trauma, the willingness to move beyond the steel and coal union of Germany and France would not have happened. That doesn't need to be argued now. It's just my sense. It's also my sense that we in the modern West, and in so much as the modern world is taking over the whole world, I think that kind of trauma is ahead of us. I think it's another generation ahead of us, and therefore hold on to your sovereignty sharing. It may be too early for it, but the day will come, depending on what kind of rubble we're digging ourselves out of. And none of us on this call will be alive to witness that. The sovereignty sharing is at a really deep ontological level. It's a move from a modern ontology, which presupposes that reality is made up of bits and pieces of things, which can be controlled and rearranged at will, to a relational world that we cannot control. And therefore, we have to learn to live relationally. And as you know, John, I'm sure, and others, there's a growing literature on the move from a fragmented sense to a relational sense, and that's part of our salvation. And I agree. What there isn't is much reflection about how deep that change is. And therefore people are talking about it as if somehow Madison Avenue marketing can do it. And they don't understand how deep we've had 800 years of building an ontological and epistemological foundation of modernity that has now worked into our language, our consciousness, our cultures, our architecture. And there's almost nobody on the planet who understands that.
Okay.
In fact, there are scattered individuals who understand it. In Canada, God bless us, there's been Northrop Frye, and there have been several Canadians outstanding in doing this work. Wilfred Cantwell Smith in the History of Religions, Northrop Frye, Harold Innes, Marshall McLuhan. But the fact is, there is no institution, and what we've got are people arguing for a relational life as if it can be glued to a modern ontological foundation, and it can't. It's like people who try to hang on to the outside of airplanes that were leaving Afghanistan. As the plane accelerated and got higher in the sky, they all fell off. You cannot glue an ethic that's at odds with modernity to modernity without dealing with modernity. And without, I think, the kind of trauma that you had, and there hasn't been much reflection in the EU or in the EC on, in that sense, the deep work that you've been pioneering. You've been doing it as if you're getting a better and more cooperative version of modernity. And there's no consciousness that you're actually blowing yourself out of modernity and leading the world out of it. Without that consciousness, there's a sense in which it may all come to naught and a waste, and in history's terms, be seen as a tragic waste because you weren't capable of doing the deep work.
Okay.
There's a person in Brussels that I know who understands that. He used to be part of the futures unit in the office of the head of the EC in the 1990s when they had, and that's Mark Loix. lives in Belgium, lives in Brussels.
Okay.
You'll put your email in the chat. I can connect you with Mark. And this is a conversation that he understands deeply.
Good.
Okay,
Okay.
let's move on. You got anything else, Ruben, you wanted to add?
No, well, just no. I'll add this later. It's not related. Thank you.
Okay, Claude, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. Sorry, I raised my hand, lower my hand. I want to applaud you, John, that you're going to do this. And I just wanted to remind you that there's a very long tradition coming out of World War II, the World Federalist Movement centered in New York. The various countries have their national units, which used to be the World Federalist Association in the United States in the late 1940s. It actually had 12,000 members. And then it atrophied after that. And I joined it when I got out of college in the early mid 70s. And I became the president of the local chapter here, which is, even though we're only 2% here in Minnesota of the US population, we were one of the more active places. And I had the pleasure of being the president, not because I'm a great leader, but because nobody on the board wanted to be president, while the real spark plug went off and finished his book, which he promoted with what was left of his life savings. And I had the pleasure of presiding over someone from who wrote a book called Global Democracy. There's many books, and there's like even a book club by our chapter, which I don't attend anymore. You can study these books that have been written over the last 50 years, 70 years ad nauseum, and they all fail to actually get the traction. So what this Belgium person said, he said, in my lifetime, there may be an end of Belgium. It may not exist as a country anymore. And he gave a brief explanation that it might be partitioned off into the various language groups, and his French part of Belgium might be part of France. But he had a suggestion for world federalism across the globe, but especially for the Citizens for Global Solutions, which, by the way, friends in Washington got us to change to Citizens for Global Solution. That sounds like something what the first Bush came up with. But anyway, that's the name today. And so his proposition was, why don't you assume that we already actually do have global governance? I didn't say government. We have governance, but it's Byzantine. Listen to his strategy. It is Byzantine and it is not democratic. The power structure we have. The G7, this is my thinking. I've extrapolated it through the years by thinking about it. To an American, this has a little bit of resonance. The G7 is actually a Senate. That's where the real power to, fund and not fund is. And then to make people feel like they're part of their government, you have the G20. And the G20 represents over 80% of the GDP of the globe. So that's a very powerful, and I've heard other people talk it this way. It's the G7 that actually project military power. That's where the real power is. It's like the sheriff is much more important than the guy who runs the county, because the sheriff can carry a gun and he's authorized to do so. So this is one thing that I'll just suggest to you, is that sometimes it might engage more people by saying, how can we get the current kind of opaque system of global governance to actually be more responsive to what we need? And I wish you luck, because I've been telling people the last several years that I'm a discouraged world federalist. I'm one of the few people that in my 30s, I paid extra so that I could be a life member of the organization. So it's a long-term thing that I feel very strongly for. There's also a group of parliamentarians. These are people who actually have the cachet. They have worked for the parliaments of and equal bodies of various countries around the world. And they meet and they propose a non-voting but very that could be an influential a global parliament. And so that might be something that you could also kick around in your discussions in Europe.
And the last thing I want to say is that I know some conservative people, and they relish the day that the EU completely falls apart and fails. And it's possible that mass migration could do that. When people realize that, it's better for us here in France, or it's better for us here in Germany to do this, regardless of what the other people want us to do. Because of the open borders, it might be a problem. So I wish you luck, but I also want to let you know that someone else said it. It's an idea whose time may never come, because the finger on the pulse, what's happening in the world today really is it's starting to fall apart. It's not coming together.
Yeah, sure.
And,
Yeah,
and don't look for leadership from the United States in the near run, because there's a lot of Trumpers that see that world government is the enemy, whether you call it communist or whether you call it, EU expanded. The only power projection on a large scale they want to see is a US run NATO.
yeah.
So I wish you luck.
Okay,
I'm done.
Raymond, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief here. So Ruben, I agree with you that the trauma right now, that the climate change trauma is not big enough to have much of an impact, right? But if you think about trauma, it's somewhat of in response to people's perception, right? So what I'm thinking is maybe there's a way to get people to perceive more trauma and to sort of manipulate it, if you will, in some way. But yeah, we're not there, right? We're not there. Now, the thing about the island that Ted was talking about, we don't need 100% solutions. And to Ted's point about the fact they're not burning the wires, right? If they're using oil-based products, I'm less concerned if the thing isn't being burned. The problem is burning of these things, and there's also obviously pollution of all sorts of stuff that during the production process and all that. But that's really, to me, the big thing. And to me, we need to eat this big elephant one bite at a time. So even if that island isn't able to get rid of fossil fuels completely, they've done everything they can, which is actually, I'm quite amazed they've been able to get where they are. But anyways, so John, back to what you were saying there, the survey of 7 out of 10 want a democratic government that could do something about climate change. I've been doing advocacy on EVs for over 10 years now, and my what I've experienced is that the vast majority of people won't spend a dime extra for something that's better for the environment. You have to sell them the solution based on what's in it for them. That's very unfortunate, and I wish it was different. But my perception is people are always looking at what's in it for me, and I think this is the root cause of the problem we have: is people are being selfish and not worrying about anybody else. And if you're looking at just your own interests, to me, it's a road to nowhere. But anyway, so if you ask those people, what's the impact on them, and do they want to pay a carbon tax or something like that? Well, the answers start to change, right? And to me, the culture is the hardest thing to change, and this is something that I've studied in the corporate world. That it's one of the things that we've been taught is that is the thing that's the hardest to change. And I could confirm here in Canada that I'm still a native French speaker after about 300 years of English rule. Okay, so culture takes a long time to change. What I think we need to do ultimately, and this is my utopic vision, is we need to find structural ways to change behaviors. What I mean by that is, if you look at green technologies today, okay, just as an example, it's now cheaper for you to run an EV than it is a conventional car. So you'll choose an EV because it's cheaper for you, not because it's better for the environment, right? So what I would like to see is governments and scientists focusing on how do we get to solutions that are less bad for the planet. And if you think about it whether you look at it from a business point of view and an environmental point of view, waste is bad. Okay, so if you're a capitalist and you want to maximize profit, you want to minimize waste, right? So, and if you look at it from that point of view, there's a lot of distance you have to cover in that space to get rid of the waste, that's causing a lot of these problems. And fossil fuels are the worst for this. I mean, most fossil fuels, we get maybe 20% of the energy that's embodied in them as useful energy that we're actually able to extract from them, right? So it's very wasteful, and that makes it more expensive. That makes it less profitable. So there should be ways for us to do things that are less wasteful and better for the planet.
All right, nobody's on deck here, so it's open.
Well, gentlemen, as I say, I'm speaking to the Club of Rome, the Belgian branch, on the 18th of December, and we're going to put forward the idea that this COP process is chaotic and it needs to be replaced by a system in which countries share sovereignty. Now, this is a completely new idea. I don't know how it's going to go down with the people who will attend the meeting, but I would certainly like to continue to listen to you and your perspective from Canada, because, you know, Canada is such an important player in this climate change business. And I would like to really continue to have a close contact and know your reactions. And I think we can come to something quite positive.
All
John,
right, David.
John, I thought you were going to respond to my thought that anytime there was an international agreement, there was a certain limitation on the sovereignty of another country. And I saw you shaking your head, and I wondered if you'd say a little bit more about your perspective.
Okay, well, the reason I shake my head is that when a country signs an international agreement, and if subsequently it breaks its promise, there is no sanction. And that's what we've been seeing a lot in the climate change arena. We've been finding a lot of countries signing up. Oh yeah, we're going to reduce our national emissions. And do they hell? No, they don't. And there is no sanction. These countries can free ride without any penalty. And thus, these agreements do not involve any sharing of sovereignty, because the countries decide that they are not going to have an enforcement mechanism. So you have the Kyoto Protocol, this Paris Agreement, lots of fine words, lots of great rhetoric, but not a single mention of a credible enforcement mechanism. And it's only when you have an enforcement mechanism, in other words, if a country free rides or reneges on its promise, that you will have an effective agreement. And therefore, governments sign these agreements. They're very willing to sign the agreements, but they know that they're going to keep all their own sovereignty because there's no enforcement mechanism. And so we have two different ways of approaching international cooperation. We have the standard, the conventional approach, which is the approach of the UN, which we're following at the moment with this COP process, because that's a child of the UN. And there's no enforcement mechanism in any of these agreements. Therefore, there's no sharing of sovereignty. There's no giving up sovereignty. The countries retain the sovereignty to themselves. That's one method, and that method is not working. The other method is the method which was proposed by Jean Monnet back in the 1950s, which the European countries have adopted. And there is an enforcement mechanism, because if countries do not respect the law, they get fined. We have a court of justice, and some countries have been fined. For instance, the first country which was fined for not respecting one of the laws, which happened to be an environmental law, was back in, I think, the 1990s, and it was Greece, and it did not respect an environmental law, and it was fined €100,000 per day. not just a one-off fine of 100,000 euro, but it was 100,000 euro per day. Now that got into the newspapers in Greece, and there was a lot of pressure from the ordinary citizen on the government to get its act together. And the government did get its act together. And so Greece has been fined once, I think. France has been fined once. Spain has been fined a couple of times. And the fact that countries can be fined and penalized for not respecting the law of the EU, that means that these countries start taking this law seriously. And that's how we get this cooperation, because we make law which the countries realize they must respect. Therefore, when they make the law, they take it seriously. They say to themselves, this proposal is going to become a law, and in a year's time, it's going to be passed by the parliament, and therefore it's going to go on a statute book, and therefore we'll have to respect it. So let's take it seriously right from the beginning.
Okay, Ted, go ahead.
Just a fast question. Which countries do not, according to their own agreement, follow international law? And what percentage of the contamination are they responsible for?
Which countries are not respecting international law?
Don't even believe it applies to them.
Well, I think a lot of countries of the world.
Not really. Not China, not US, not Russia, not
I think a lot
Iran.
of countries of the world are not respecting international law.
Yeah, those are the ones who have expressly said it does not apply to them, and not bought into the various ones, including, quite frankly, most of them to IPCC, among many.
It's a disgrace. I mean, it's a farce.
Yeah.
You have these meetings, the countries say yes, 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 and they go back home and they say, well, this agreement, we'll chuck it in the bin.
Yeah.
There's
Well,
no
many of them
but
don't chuck it in the bin visibly. They just fail to respect it and do what they said they would.
Yeah, but
John,
I think the fundamental problem is that the reason there's no teeth in those agreements is because there's countries, and the US in particular, that refuse to be told by others what they should do, and they don't want enforcement mechanisms. So it's a bit of a, I mean, if you added enforcement mechanisms, you would have these countries not signing up anyway, so you wouldn't get any further. That's why I think we should look at what does work right now and how can we leverage what's worked already and figure out, how to get more results, right?
No, my position, is that nobody has yet proposed that there should be a credible enforcement mechanism. But now that 7 out of 10 people in the world, according to this research, 7 out of 10 ordinary people in the world want a world government which is democratic and which can deal with global issues such as climate change, I think now is a good opportunity to put the idea forward that there should be an enforcement mechanism.
John, I just make one comment. If we go to the 100,000 euros per day that Greece was facing as a sanction, the other side of that coin is, in order for Greece to remain in that European agreement and to accept that those sanctions are legitimate, they have to perceive that the benefits of being inside the EU are enormous benefits.
Yeah.
And when there's a failure to see the really large benefits, you gradually get reduced to the most ineffective machinery of the United Nations, because countries there are not seeing a benefit that's worth paying the sanction and giving up that degree of sovereignty. But I would just argue that there's a huge range in the international arena of different levels of sanctions. If you look at international trade agreements, I mean, you're talking about some of the very strongest that have ever been brought into agreements among countries. And I mean, I can only wish you luck, but I do think that whoever said that we're living in an era where that's not too likely, The fact that 7 out of 10 in the world, I don't know if that's enough to move people right now. I think that what is required are greater disasters. And the greater
Yeah, maybe.
disasters begin to
Maybe.
up the perception that maybe the benefits of something new could be worthwhile.
Yeah.
But I frankly just have not seen the evidence yet in the more affluent countries that the disasters have been of a high enough degree. So that's maybe a dark comment, but it's my present perception.
Okay, Ruben, go ahead.
Yeah, to just build on that, one of the things that has been said by several people who have faced crises that, to a large extent, were off the mental map of the culture at the time, is the observation that crises tend to get dealt with by the set of ideas that are readily available at the time.
Mm.
And therefore, John, I want to say, do what you're doing. Even if nobody responds, even if they beat the crap out of you in the meeting and whatnot. I mean, it's, and in part, you need to know this is also self-justification for Ruben Nelson's life. Because I learned early, I was fired by a prime minister when I was 31. Once you've been fired by a prime minister, nobody else threatens you. So you become independent enough to, you know,
Yeah.
to your own hole, just to hold your own role. But we need ideas out there, even if they're strange, because when the conditions change, we need them thought enough about that somebody in the room can say, well, I've spent a little time here, and here's a set of notions and the logic of them that may help us with this crisis.
Yeah.
And one of the things that worries me deeply is the way in which I live in Alberta, which is country-worst province in Canada, when it comes to the populist movement who understand government understand democracy as governments have a legal obligation to give the majority of people what they want. And the majority of people have no obligation to be educated or understand or what they're actually asking for.
Yeah. Well, to come back to David's point, you were saying that perhaps the pain has to get greater. You know, if I understood correctly, David. I agree with that. Maybe the disasters are not big enough to shift the mindset of our politicians, but the fact that 7 out of 10 people now want a world government is sort of ammunition for people like us. When we go to politicians, we can say, look, if you put this idea forwards, the likelihood is that a majority of your electorate will actually support you. So I think that's that's a very encouraging point, that we can argue for a democratic world government which has the authority to deal with climate change. We can argue for that to our politicians, and we can say, and the majority of the people in the world actually want this. So if you, politician, put this forward, you can expect to get support from your constituents. So I think this is a game changer. So that's why I said, when I came across this research only a couple of months ago, I was absolutely astonished. And I didn't realize that ordinary people now are suffering the pain, or they're reading about the pain in the newspapers or seeing it on their televisions or social media. And they say, climate change, we don't want this. And the UN and our governments, they're not sorting it out. So we want something different. And they come to the conclusion themselves that a world government to deal with this problem is now necessary.
Well, Donald Trump will be happy to give it to you.
John, did you put the link to that study of 7 out of 10 in the chat? Oh.
Yeah, I put it in the chat. It's
Okay,
by,
good. Okay,
a
because
young,
we'll
a
publish
young
that.
man in, it's by
I
a
have
young
one
student in
question,
Oxford.
since I do set those kinds of surveys, have for many years for the UN. It's very questionable. You really have to disaggregate down to subsets and individual continents and individual countries. And I would love to see that, to see how it varies among countries. There are some where they're used to having someone tell them what to do, and with luck, they've been doing it well. There are others that are not at all prepared to let anybody do things for or to them for their own particular reasons. And that's a lot of history in that. No point in going into it now. But certainly in Africa, you can get two countries right next to each other, one of which would love to have global governance and the other would like to have any governance. So I'd love to see that. I'd love to see the results of that.
Yeah,
Well, I put the reference in the chat box,
please.
Yeah.
and it's by Gassam and
Yep.
Bowley. And Gassam is a lecturer at Oxford, and
Right.
Bowley is a lecturer at Dublin.
Okay. Well, then
Yeah,
they
so-
probably used a useful methodology to make it worthwhile reading. Yeah.
So as I said before, the trauma is a perception that individuals have, right? My concern on that, and to me, if I look at the impacts of climate change already, they're traumatizing to me, okay? But
Yeah.
we have the fossil fuel industry telling everybody that this is normal cycles, this is nothing to worry about, right? So I think one of the challenges we have is to make people realize what the link is, so that they feel the trauma, so that they want to react to it. Because I think right now a lot of people, they're just not they're not there.
Okay, Ruben, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to change the channel a little bit, because part of this is about what could we do now that is different. So let me just share an idea very briefly that has been stirring in me, just on the basis of some research that at least is new to me. It may not be new out there, but when I discover things that I didn't know before, they're at least new to me. And that is the extraordinary percentage that the CO2 issue globally can be seen as an issue of those who are extraordinarily rich. That if you actually stop seeing it as it's a problem of 8 billion people, but it's actually a creation of way less than 1 billion in terms of the people who are the 1% on the planet, which includes most of us. And that therefore, I mean, it would be interesting for Canadian CACOR, if we're looking for a project, to actually do a serious research project on this and think through, is there a different strategy that instead of saying it's the oil companies, of saying, no, what we're targeting is in fact all those who have been elites and close to elites in our modern societies. And if we get them to change their behavior, maybe we need to go back to the 91% income tax that was existed in Canada and the US at the end of the Second World War, and literally deal with consumption by the over consumers, rather than trying to deal with this as a societal issue. So it strikes me that that's really interesting, and our inability to even talk about it says things about our culture that I don't want to think about. You know, I don't want to know that we don't have the courage to deal with this publicly.
Okay, Ted, go ahead.
Yeah, just a reaction to that. That data does exist. I even know the particular projects where it is being generated under one of the articles of the Sustainable Development Goals under consumption. And there is documentation of that, and there are actual suggestions. That's where we came up with the idea of people's own right to consumption as setting a standard and bringing it in as one of the approaches. But there is data showing exactly the levels of consumption of various things, fossil fuels definitely being one of them. and also looking at measures to alter people's consumption patterns, including the constraints to doing so due to the fact that they live in a place where they freeze to death if they don't, you don't do it, and so on. That data does exist. I can give you some references to those particular products. They are underway as we speak because we defined them as necessary back about 8 years ago when we started in this stuff for the 2030 goals. So they do exist, and I have not seen the results of all of them yet.
And it hasn't yet changed the conversation at all.
Oh, the politicians don't wish to change the conversation or activities alone. They're paid not to.
Ed, it hasn't even changed the conversation in CACOR.
That's because the results are not out yet, and you're the first person to ask for them.
See what we do.
Okay,
Mhm.
we've been going at this for an hour and a half.
Mhm.
And I suggest we might want to wind down. We'll get some last minute comment. But
Yeah.
it's my plan, of course, this has been recorded. So we will have a video of it because I know John Hollins and others have expressed interest because they can't be here. I will also publish the chat and the attendees. We got one chart. I'll publish that. And I'm going to throw in something extra as well, in that I've had the AI companion running the entire time. I'm not quite sure how they're going to go and summarize what this was all about, but I'm looking forward to seeing what the output is going to be. And
Do
I'll
we get
share
to
it with
deny
you
it
all.
completely, Art?
It would be interesting to compare it with the Five Eyes AI version.
There you go.
Okay, anybody Rick, you sat here and listened to all this and did you want to make any comment at all?
Well, I hardly know where to start. I don't share John's optimism at all. I think that it's very easy to get 7 out of 10 people to agree that they want something done about climate change and that somebody else, namely a world government, would somehow magically do it. That's fine until we realize that it involves giving up a fair bit of not only sort of national sovereignty, personal pleasures and enjoyments and so on, but it requires radically changing how much energy, especially, and other resources we consume, and the entire structure of our economy. I certainly agree with Bill Rees and others who view climate change as a symptom of overshoot, a symptom of many things, and not just we're overly fixated on it. There are many more issues. It's one of the 9 planetary boundaries and so on. Agriculture's intimately involved with 6 of them.
Mhm.
We've got way more on our plate than just that. And in terms of revamping COP, which was the focus of this, I mean, boy, I don't have any bright ideas, but I mean, I certainly agree with most of what's been said here today, and it's morphed into something that's completely useless. It's important that people do question it, criticize it, and look for something better. Would start with excluding all sorts of commercial interests. Absolutely. Speaking of studies, I've just finished reading it here, a very short little 4-pager on why governments don't listen to scientists. It just dated December the 5th yesterday. I think somebody here posted it. I think that's where I saw it. And
Yeah,
very concise and very to the point, I guess. Anyways, that's nothing new in what I'm saying, but those are my thoughts, I guess.
Okay, and anyone last go, and otherwise I'll wind this up and try
Thank
and
you.
get this. Okay,
Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you, John. I'm glad you were able to join us.
yes,
Okay.
yeah,
Thanks,
good to
Ruben.
see you
You
again.
see how much fun an acerbic comment can be?
Yes.
By the way, I have one other comment just for information. We now know who the new co-president is of the Club of Rome internationally. It's Silvia Zimmerman de Castillo from Argentina, and she's a good friend of ours. So we will probably get more feedback directly from them in future, because I was one of the 3 people who nominated her. So with luck, we may have some degree of influence. And that's what we've really been talking about today. Who can you influence? Not easy.
Can we get her as a CACOR live speaker?
Yes, probably.
Okay, why don't you
Probably
chase
want to
that down?
talk about either sovereignty or water.
Okay, if you could chase her down, boy, that would be great.
Not for the next couple of weeks. We want to at least let her get her breath.
Yeah, understand.
Okay.
Okay, that's it.
But
and
yes, we will definitely try and get her. We may even try to get her come up to Canada.
Okay. Oh, that would be
Okay.
nicer. Yeah. Okay. Bye now.